Welcome to Tom Rhodes Radio Smart Camp. Today's episode is about Lord Byron, exile, and death. This is the last part of Lord Byron's life. In case you missed the earlier episodes, there's so many details about this guy's life. He's fascinating. Bisexual, kind of spoiled guy who was made a lord through inheritance. Inherits the family home, Newstead Abbey, which he partied at, had sex with his half sister. They didn't grow up together. Is that forgivable? Maybe if you close one eye when you have sex with your half sister. How do you justify that? That's going to come back and haunt him. He becomes wildly famous from writing this book, The Pilgrimage of Childe Harold. And he was a wild man. And he thought getting married was going to somehow cure him of his wild dog ways. And he married this woman, Annabella. Here's a little description of Annabella. Yet a question. Annabella seems to have been a humorless and hypocritical prude, an incipient shrew, as her behavior to her parents showed, a would-be intellectual, sanctimonious, self-justifying, prim, prejudiced, and totally encased in a complacent, self-regarding virtue. She was, in almost every particular, precisely the kind of woman, the kind of person Byron had always detested. She had neither true beauty nor high spirits to tip the balance in her favor, nor was she in the slightest degree boyish, in a way which might have stimulated Byron's less orthodox fancies. That means he occasionally liked to sleep with guys. So he gets involved in the theater, and he's partying. He's addicted to opium. He's running up high tabs all over town, having sex with actresses. And finally, his wife, who he treated very badly, she dumps him. And she knew, because he rubbed it in her face, that he had sex, not only had sex with his sister, but he impregnated her. So this becomes a massive scandal. High society London, there was a big party thrown, and all of high society London showed up just to snub him, basically, and walk out. So his life is falling apart. He's rented an apartment, and this woman, Claire, shows up. And she is basically a groupie and wants to have sex with him. And he reluctantly has sex with her. I don't know how you reluctantly have sex with somebody, but that's the way it's described. Her sister is Mary, who's dating the poet Shelley. So that's going to be the link to this great friendship between Byron and Shelley, is this woman Claire. So he has to leave the country, and he's in love with Greece from an earlier trip he took as a young, when he got out of school, the gap year, if you will, and he believes that his destiny and his fate is to go die in one of these foreign lands, a hero. So we pick up today's episode of Exile and Death with Byron leaving the country, never to return to England. He was pretty much a rock star, one of the most famous people of the period. He got famous in 1812. His hero was Napoleon. Everyone else in Europe was afraid of Napoleon and hated him, but Byron thought that Napoleon was the only person who was equal to him. So check this out. He leaves England, and he hires his own personal doctor, this young guy named Polidori, who is kind of a moron. He's entitled. He doesn't have good social skills. Gets on everyone's nerves in the party. Byron's got a little team of servants traveling with him, and he hires his own doctor, Polidori. So Byron had, at one of the battles with Napoleon, um, one of Napoleon's carriages was seized, and Byron had an exact copy made. Check this out. Byron and Polidori enjoyed the comforts of the enormous traveling carriage, copied from the celebrated one of Napoleon taken at Genappe, which Byron had commissioned before leaving England, and which among its other amenities contained a bar, a plate chest, and every apparatus for dining. So here's this pimp who liked to dress in extravagant clothes and big hats, and he's pretty much rolling like a gangster. So Napoleon was defeated in 1812. This is 1816, when Byron has to flee England. And this is from the book Byron in Italy. And this is pretty much my favorite highlight of everything I've read. So they land in the lowlands. They go through the Netherlands and Belgium. From Brussels, they took horse to the field of Waterloo. This is where Napoleon was defeated, at Waterloo. This is only 4 years later. From Brussels, they took horse to the field of Waterloo, and here at last was a scene that Byron found stimulating. His own career had often been likened to Napoleon's, and not by hyperbolic admirers alone, for he too, in his stormier and more arrogant moments, saw and admitted a parallelism between their destinies. He had been damned sorry when he had heard the news of Napoleon's fall. Now, himself fallen, defeated, in exile, he rode slowly with Polidori across the pastoral upland where the peasants were whistling as they worked in the fields, and only patched plaster on farmhouse walls showed the effects of artillery fire. The farm of Hougoumont, however, was still in ruins. 1,500 Englishmen had been slaughtered just beyond its garden. Here the Scots Greys had parted their ranks to allow a masked battery to pour in its broadsides into the waves of furiously advancing corsairs. There, through a gap in the garden hedge, the French had charged again after dreadful losses. A little further on, noted Polidori, we were shown the spot where Colonel Howard, my friend's cousin, was buried before being carried to England. For Byron, the memory of this young man had a double interest, since Howard was the son of his guardian, Lord Carlisle, whose neglect had done so much to embitter his boyhood, and to whom he had consecrated one of the most savage couplets of his early satire. In the poem he was preparing, he would make amends. Meanwhile, peasant boys with glittering handfuls of buttons ran beside their stirrups. There were French cockades on sale, swords, eagles, helmets, breastplates scarred by bullets, dinted and seamed by lance or saber. Always a great collector of tokens and trophies, Byron made some purchases to send back to England. Then they turned their horses' heads and galloped homewards, helter-skelter, over the springy turf of the battlefield, Byron chanting the refrain of a Turkish song. Excuse me. I wish somebody would make a movie of Byron's life. I saw something that the BBC did that was just, him being debaucherous in Italy. I would love to see this scene of Byron riding on the field at Waterloo, where his hero was defeated, and then hauling ass on his horse, singing a Turkish song. He was 28, and yet his hair was already graying. Not without a kind of desperate satisfaction, he considered the astonishing completeness of his personal destiny, which had transported him in a moment to the heights of fame, then plunged him back with almost as little notice to the depths of disaster. That disaster, it was true, he had perhaps exaggerated. The injury to his pride had been extremely severe. The appalling scene at Lady Jersey's party, excuse me, that's when everybody got up and walked out on him, where half fashionable London had assembled to cut him, and he had stood lonely and defiant amid a collapsing world, was the kind of episode that it is not easy to live down. Both his love and his self-love had been cruelly mangled, but he had still friends, prodigious celebrity, health, and freedom. And there goes the garbage truck making too much noise. So he makes it to Lake Geneva in Switzerland, and he goes into a hotel and he sees Claire, the woman who, the groupie who showed up at his door, and she thought that Byron was her destiny because her sister was with the poet Shelley, and through Claire is this amazing harmonic convergence of the universe. Byron becomes friends with Shelley, and then he rented this villa next to where Shelley lived, and they were there for, I don't know, like a year. And Shelley and Byron both had enough money where they commissioned their own personal ships, little boats, and they were sailing on Lake Geneva in Switzerland and riding horses, fond of laughter and wine and convivial hubbub. Among strangers, he was supercilious because suspicious, on guard against some affront to his feelings and dignity, and as long as the suspicion lasted, affected a mood which might again dissolve into jocular friendship. Jocular. Shelley retained the manners of the patrician class, and was as perfect a gentleman as ever crossed a drawing room. Shelley's opinions might be perverse, and his behavior eccentric. His clothes might be rumpled and stained and tattered, but he had inherited a grace and a savoir-vivre that Byron appreciated, envied perhaps, for his own manners were shy and awkward. But Shelley, though in many respects remarkably shrewd, was on the whole of an exceedingly gullible temperament, and just as often deluded by himself as deceived by others. So Shelley was like a free love kind of hippie guy. And there was one scene where somebody wanted to fight him, and he said, I'm a poet, I do not fight. He laughed at the thought of having to fight somebody. So so it's Villa Diodati is where one of the most historic events in literature happens. So they would have these parties. Byron would have these parties at Villa Diodati, and they would tell ghost stories. And there was the summer that they were there was a volcano somewhere on the other side of the world, like Indonesia or Iceland, that kind of blackened the skies of Europe, and it was known as the summer without sunshine. So imagine these guys boating on Lake Geneva and riding horses, and then Byron would go off on little expeditions to climb up the French Alps, and just like imagine this like kind of gray soot in the sky. It was really spooky. So the significant events that happens at Villa Diodati is that they get together and they write these ghost stories, and they were all encouraged to come up with a story that would scare the shit out of everybody. And Mary Shelley, she eventually marries Shelley, and she becomes Mary Shelley. She came up with the story Frankenstein. And Polidori, even though he was a horse's ass and nobody liked him, he came up with this story called The Vampire, which later Bram Stoker made into Dracula. So it's pretty amazing that at this one party and this one house, these lasting stories of horror all came to be. So pretty significant. Shelley has a tragic, where is it? Although Byron took up only with the utmost reluctance, and under her unremitting and immodest pressure, this is Claire, his old relationship with Claire, he settled with instant delight into friendship with Shelley, soon renting the Villa Diodati. He had become Shelley's neighbor, and there now began an almost continuous conversation. Talk taken up nightly and long into the night, discussion, speculation, statement, argument, humor, philosophy, criticism. Shelley opening for Byron an ethereal vision different from anything he had imagined hitherto. He was even for a while reconciled to the works of Wordsworth, which he loathed. Byron hated Wordsworth. He thought it was absolute garbage. The moment and the vision passed. Byron was a man who found the ether heavy going, moving swiftest on earth. Shelley, nevertheless, became convinced from this time on that Byron was the most extraordinary man, the most extraordinary poet of the age. But despite all the talk and laughter, despite all the sailing he and Shelley did on the great lake by which their houses stood, despite the tours they made, Byron continued as always to work. That's one thing these books emphasize, that no matter what's going on in Byron's life, how everything's falling apart, the different stages and different places, he always finds the time to sit down and write his ass off. Byron wrote back to Thomas More, "You were all brutally mistaken about Shelley, who was, without exception, the best and least selfish man I ever knew. I never knew one who was not a beast in comparison." So Shelley goes out in a storm and dies. And then they burned Shelley's body. It's kind of disturbing. They identified his body. I forget what book it was. Maybe it'll pop up here. Byron had given him a personal copy of this book. And they found this bloated dead body. "I am glad of it," ejaculated the doctor. "I am glad to see you can suffer pain. Let me advise you," Polidori retorted, Byron in a calm, suppressed tone, but with unnatural emphasis, "when you, another time, hurt anyone, not to express your satisfaction. People don't like to be told that those who give them pain are glad of it." Yeah, this guy's a dick. Excuse me. And I have a locked up throat. Yeah, Polidori gets on everybody's nerves, and then he leaves, goes off to Milan. They run into him later, and he had problems with the authority, but nobody liked Polidori. And then later, Byron tries to do this. He's got so much money. He eventually. Well, I gotta find this part where Shelley's dead, because they burn his body. It's pretty gruesome. Here we go. Where is the part where Shelley dies? So, yeah, are they in Italy? Yeah, I guess they're in Italy when it's pretty gruesome. Shit, where's the part where Shelley dies? They burn him. There's the one description in the book, and where Shelley's skull cracks open, and Byron can see his brains kind of bubbling and shit. It was really disturbing. He learned, moreover, the news that had gone back to England, that he and that notorious atheist, young Mr. Shelley, had established a satanic league of incest. So everybody's thinking all this weird shit back in England. And then Byron would write letters back to his the guy who published, his agent, basically. And then he would let all these rich guys in England, these society dudes, they'd come around and drink brandy and read Byron's letters, because Byron was living in Venice, screwing his brains out. Venice was pretty much the Amsterdam of the day, and Byron was there for a couple of years, and pretty much got tired of screwing his brains out. Where is this Shelley dying? Okay, I think you get it. Boop 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 doop boop boop boop. Okay, yeah. So Byron had taken up shedding tears of humiliation, foaming with rage, and swearing that he would one day return and bestow manual castigation on the governor, but helpless against authorities offended might. Polidori left the city early in the morning. Yeah, that was when he had a scene in Milan. He was disconcerted by Byron's frequent references to his patricial birth, by his perverse parade of aristocratic prejudices, and by his desire to be regarded as a dandy and a man of fashion. Brummel, no less than Napoleon, was the poet's hero. Beau Brummel was the first dandy. And so self-conscious was he on the subject of his own attractions, and so constantly preoccupied with the effect they made, that there were moments when he seemed oddly impervious to the appeal of the opposite sex. Okay, here we go. Toward the watery element, both Byron and Shelley felt a profound attraction. Shelley, though no swimmer and a clumsy sailor, was seldom happier or more carefree than by sea or stream. Even a rivulet or a small pool would inspire and soothe him. Maternal yet destructive, uncontrollable by human will or human reason, the sea is an image of death and eternity, the earth of the human mind and its infinite conquests. The origin of Byron's feelings were partly matter of fact, and if he loved the sea and delighted in Venice, it was because he found water a friendly medium which gratified his liking for speed and his desire for power. On land he moved awkwardly and was aware of his handicap. But when he swam, his deformity was not perceptible. He had a club foot, in case you forgot. The limbs that balked at the dance floor could traverse the Hellespont. He was daring and self-confident, strong and envied. Here in Venice, he could minimize the effort of walking. Onto Piazza San Marco he rarely ventured, but slip, indolent, cool, reflective, down endless waterways. So yeah, he loved Venice. It wasn't overrun with tourists like it is now. Like the waterways were actually used. It was a city, and it was a debaucherous city, and especially the carnival. And he moves in. Some man had a barber shop. He moves above it, and he's having sex with the barber shop's owner. Naturally, he lost no time in beginning a love affair. This was a method of settling down he had always favored. It reassured him to be loved and to believe that he loved in turn. But the need was psychological rather than strictly physical. For though Byron's appetites were impetuous and even greedy, like many other philanderers who make love their business, he exploited his gift of attracting women, at least, as often as he employed it to gain him pleasure. Were the sexual impulse always governed by sexual motives, human relationships would present a somewhat easier study. In fact, the emotions that we find it convenient to describe as desire or love usually split up under analysis into several component passions, many of them apparently divorced from sexual feeling. Social vanity, for example, may play an exceedingly important part, and men or women who have established their own attraction tend to utilize it as a weapon against society, either as an aggressive weapon to subdue their fellows, now and then by humiliating or torturing a weaker partner, or as a means of upholding their pride and defending their self-esteem. Conversely, love may be a method of self-punishment, but here again the issues involved are far from simple. And the lover, as at times it had happened to Byron, may find punishment in an acute consciousness of the harm he is doing, or may create a situation in which he is bound to suffer injury, in which betrayal must succeed to confidence as night to day. Unhappy lovers are frequently lovers who seek unhappiness, suffering being the intoxicant they distill from pleasure. The physical satisfaction that the downright sensualist considers he aims at may be subordinate to a dozen mysterious motives, besides which the influence of desire is slight and transitory. Okay, this is Peter Quinnell, Byron in Italy, this book, and he often goes off on speculation. Finally, a brilliant narrator and a born spectator, gifted with an appreciation of drama and a sense of comedy, he had been fascinated always by the odd spectacle his life afforded. It amazed him when he considered it, the extent of his composure. No doubt it would not last. Yet, if I could but remain as I am now, he wrote to Kennard on November 27th, I should not merely be happy, but contented, which in my mind is the strangest and the most difficult attainment of the two. For anyone who will hazard enough may have moments of happiness. His present way of life was rational yet voluptuous. Not only had he books and a decent establishment, a fine country and the language that he preferred, but thrown in with them was a handsome woman who did not bore him, who had neither prudery nor principles, was neither chaste nor calculating. This is when he's with Mariana. Mariana was unusually attractive and seemed uncommonly sensible. So one thing Byron does when he's in Venice is he sits down and he writes his memoirs. He writes this. It's going to be a famous story among his friends. All these rich guys back in London. He writes a tell-all memoir about all of the women that he fucked and men, and he goes into great detail. So here's all these high society women, Lady Melbourne, Lady Blessington, and all these women that he grew up with, and he writes a detailed description of all the sexual activity he had with them. So when he leaves Venice, one of his friends is visiting him, and he gives the friend this manuscript wrapped in paper to take back to England and be published one day to, set the world on fire with all these scandalous things that would have erupted in these proper rich people's lives. So after Byron dies, this is the famous scene. They're all sitting around his agent publishers, his study, and they're all having a conversation about it, and they all vote that it would be best to burn the manuscript and save all these people the humiliation and their secrets getting out. So we will never know what weird, freaky shit Lady Blessington and Lady Melbourne were up to. Okay. Since letter writing was a kind of thinking aloud, and he seldom thought of her, Claire Clairmont continued to remind him of her life and feelings, in neither of which could flatter himself that he retained the smallest interest. He did retain enough interest in Claire to impregnate her, and they had a daughter named Allegra. And then Claire went back to England and brings Allegra with her, and he lived in Rome for a while, and then Pisa, or Ravenna, and then Pisa. Um, he thought it was best that he raised Allegra, and he had her put into a monastery with some nuns. And the child was neglected, and she wasn't eating properly, and it was cold, and Allegra died at this monastery. So he said that he wanted to raise her, but she wasn't with him. He stuck her in a convent. So that's another really nasty thing that he did. Rome itself inspired other far deeper emotions, for it was not among picture galleries that he had defined them, but the whole city opened in a vast perspective of decay and splendor, which delighted him beyond everything. Since Athens and Constantinople, his days were spent on horseback, either riding around the city to the Colosseum, a lunar skeleton patched with shaggy forest growths, to the Palatine, a jungle ruin half man-made and half natural, or out towards the Alban hills over the Campagna, where the broken aqueducts stepped away across the landscape, and Siracti, along the tawny horizon, swept upwards in a gentle curve, a long, delicate, fluid line like an arrested ocean swell. Imagine, so Rome was still in ruins. Nobody went there, and he gets to ride his horse all over Rome. I love these images of Byron's life. Like he's in Venice, and he had this gondolier, his own personal gondolier, this guy had a beard, and he had pistols, and he was wild eyes, and he was partying like a madman. He was partying like Tom Rhodes in Amsterdam, 2002. It was at this time that an English matron, coming face to face with him among her offspring on the roof of St. Peter's in Rome, ordered the young ladies to avert their eyes. So deadly was the fascination of the most casual glance he threw. So these English women thought that Byron was the devil, and looking him in the eyes might have hypnotized them. Who knows what? They might have dropped onto their knees and filleted him right there at the spiritual center of the Catholic Church. For a man who professed to be wretched, he was at least extremely active. Not content with the usual round of sights in and around the city, and was seeing the Pope alive and the Cardinal dead, both of whom looked very well indeed. He took a fancy to attend a Roman execution. It was not the first time that he had witnessed such a spectacle, for in 1812 he had sat up all night with two school friends to see the crazy assassin Bellingham launched into eternity among the grim and squalid of the English hanging. The sandbag dropped, the huge ferocious drunken crowd roaring and tossing in dark waves beneath the scaffold, and the yells of the execration. Let's look it up. Let's look it up. What is this word? Bear with me while we learn new things.
Execration.
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 Did you say execration?
Execration.
The act of cursing or denouncing.
Execration.
The act of cursing or denouncing. I love it. And the yells of execration that greeted the appearance of the hangman. By comparison, the guillotine seemed a merciful instrument, and the whole ceremony dignified and almost heretic. The masked priests, half-naked executioners, the bandaged criminals, the black Christ and his banner, the scaffold, the soldiery, the slow procession, and the quick rattle and heavy fall of the axe, the splash of the blood and the ghastliness of the exposed heads. Here was nothing of the dog-like agony he had watched in Bellingham, but although two of the criminals behaved calmly enough, the first to suffer died with great terror and reluctance, which was very horrible, and the priest was obliged to drown his exclamations by still louder exhortations. Wow, so the guy's screaming and the priest is getting louder and louder, reading his shit from the Bible. Then the knife thudded smoothly down and the scene was over. Byron had a place close to the scaffold, and being an amateur of strange sights and violent sensations, one moreover who was engrossed by the idea of death, he had come as to the theater equipped with an opera glass. Hilarious. He brought his theater opera glass. Now his hand shook so that he could scarcely hold it, and the experience left him, he discovered, quite hot and thirsty. But the second and third deaths had little effect on him, though he admitted that he would have saved the men had it been within his power, which shows how dreadfully soon things grow indifferent, an observation that alone was perhaps worth making. Well, the sights and sounds of Rome, 1817, whatever year this is. Oh, so one thing Lady Byron does when he leaves, she becomes good friends with Augusta Lee, his sister that he impregnated, and it was pretty nasty. She gets the sister to admit what had happened, which she didn't really have full proof yet. So Lady Byron, as Annabella, his ex-wife, is known. This just popped up on page 78. And Lady Byron's feelings had yet another side, mixed with prudence, a tinge of natural irritation, and a touch of the vengefulness that usually accompanies offended virtue. Even in a temperament so carefully self-controlled, so minutely self-appraised as that of Annabella, was one of the strongest and most irrational of human emotions, the passionate, instinctive jealousy of love rejected. Yes, she was jealous of Augusta and would always remain so. Typical of jealousy in its extremer forms is the belief that, when certainty has been arrived at, as soon as the worst is known and the depths of humiliation have been explored, the intensity of the pain felt may begin to diminish. Okay, whatever. I'm tired of that woman. He's in Italy, Diodoti. Okay. I know we're going to find Shelley's death in here somewhere. Can you hear the pages turning? Of the English laboring classes he had known little or nothing, though he had been familiar with the flash world of boxers and fencers, and had taken a particular interest in the affairs of his Newstead household. But in Venice he surrounded himself with men and women drawn from the very lowest levels of the Italian populace, harlots and pimps and gondoliers, and their dependents and families. During the same century, another Englishman, one of very different aspect and moral outlook, was to devote his genius to the declining city and make a temporary home there. But when Ruskin walked the piazza before the great basilica, he averted his eyes with shuddering revulsion from the spectacle of the Venetian proletariat, from the knots of men who, in the porch of San Marco, among the columns of jasper, serpentine beneath the delicate interlacements of Byzantine capitals, lay all day long, basking in the sun like lizards, while unregarded children, every heavy glance of their young eyes full of desperation and stony depravity, and their throats hoarse with cursing, gambol and fight and snarl and sleep hour after hour, clashing their bruised centesimi. Hey, let's learn another word. Centesimi. Centesimi. What does it say?
Centesimo.
I want centesimi. a former monetary unit equal to Italian lira. Upon the marble edges of the church porch, it is not unreasonable to imagine that in these savage congeries were the sons and grandsons of men who had once known Byron, who had run clandestine errands for him in the Venetian byways, or had enjoyed his hospitality in the servants' quarters of the Palazzo Mocenigo, more philosophic and less intellectual than the Victorian aesthete. Byron discovered that he had much to learn from the Venetian underworld. Energy he worshipped, and it was certainly abundant here. The Fornarnia, who, though not for some time a regular intimate, strode in and out of his apartments just as it suited her, was the personification of force and greed and animal violence, mixed with animal devotion to her chosen bedfellow. Moreover, she made him laugh, an exceedingly important point. In her faziolo, she looked beautiful, but alas, she longed for a hat and feathers, and in spite of anything that Byron could say or do, in spite of his burning her hats as soon as she had bought them, she insisted on attempting to play the lady. Then she would have her gowns with a tail. Nothing would serve her, and as her cursed pronunciation of the word made him laugh, there was an end of all controversy, and she dragged this diabolical train after her everywhere. Byron appreciated the chance of economizing. Almost for the first time, his expenditure did not exceed his income. The rent of his palace on the Grand Canal. Oh, yeah. So he rents this palace on the Grand Canal. And he's got horses. There's some island off the coast of, or peninsula that goes out to a tip. And then I think you could take a little ferry with your horses to this island. So he's just riding horses and taking boat trips, screwing his brains out. And he rents this massive palace on the Grand Canal, which he had taken fully furnished from its Venetian owner, amounted only to £200 a year, and although he had spent £5,000 since his arrival in Venice, at least 2/3 of that amount had been devoted to women. But with security developed a realization of the value of money. The writer who had once declined to accept his royalties, which he preferred should become the prerequisite of his old friend Dallas, had now a very different attitude towards literary money-making, drove a hard bargain with his London publisher, and was a peremptory in his demands for a punctual settlement. Independence had begun to bring out a vein of stubbornness, and the egotism of a man who had always been lazy, was now complicated by the habits that are bred of solitude, the self-sufficiency of an egotist who has been much alone. His freedom of action and peace of spirit he was determined to safeguard. Oh, here you go. This is the people in England eating up. So as all these rich tourists would come, it was called the Grand Tour. People with money and the means to do so would go down to Italy and see these famous sites into Greece. And so now Byron's living there, and all these people who see him go back to England, and they've all got wild stories about him. Plus, he's writing letters that are being circulated in John Murray's... John Murray was his agent back in his office. Why don't I shut up and read more? Wild stories of Byron's life in Italy had already been circulating. Much might be forgiven to an Englishman who was young and rich, but even in Venice he was considered a somewhat extravagant personage, and he himself had never been reluctant to improve a scandal. Otherwise, what need to keep John Murray posted in the details of his love affairs and escapades? He knew that his letters would be handed around in Murray's parlor, and that literary gatherings at decorous Albemarle Street in a setting of mahogany and damask and Turkish carpet beneath the solemn classic busts that adorned the bookcase, would be stirred and enlivened by his account of some passing passion. The carnival acquaintance, a little bichantie, whatever that is. Fuck. Bachanti.
Bacchant.
Bacchant. Whoa, it looks like Bachanti.
Bacchant.
A priestess or female follower of Bacchus, the wine god. Nice. Oh.
Bacchant.
A priestess or female follower of Bacchus, the wine god.
Bacchant.
Well, that's a good word to learn. Screen grab. A little Bacchant, whom he had made an appointment to meet that evening at her milliner's, or the peasant girl he had picked up on his daily ride. In scandal, as in everything else, he liked effrontery. And although his reputation, which by that time was beyond repair, suffered perhaps very little extra damage, and though the faculties of mind and imagination did not deteriorate, there were presently hints that his nerves were rattled, and his health disordered. Solitude was beginning to make him touchy and petulant. Petulant means fat. True, he enjoyed the society of his social inferiors, but he missed his equals, and it infuriated him that his London friends, absorbed in their world of pleasure and politics, Kennard getting rid of his mistress, John Cam angling for election to Parliament, should be inattentive to his request and unpunctual in the replies they sent to his letters. Might they not have guessed that he was sometimes lonely? The commissions he gave them were seldom executed, and when he wrote for the hair oil, tooth powder, the wrong articles were often procured, or the books and medicines he required were delayed in transit. For its real root is very different from its apparent one. The fact was that the Italian women among whom Byron spent his time were perhaps the most contemptible of all who exist under the moon, the most ignorant, the most disgusting, the most bigoted. Countesses smell so strongly of garlic that an ordinary Englishman cannot approach them, while Lord Byron is familiar with the lowest sort of these women, the people his gondolieri pick up on the streets. Somebody wrote that back to England. Somebody who had hung out with him and observed him. If he remembered Byron distinctly, it was a young and slender, but 24 months of Venetian excesses and the Venetian climate had altered his physical entity as much as it had changed his moral being. With his long graying curls, his rings and brooches, the outmoded clothes he wore, he suggested less the eminent poet than the declining dandy, an expatriate of dubious propensities, but distinguished origins, the somewhat spoiled and shit. He was a man of pleasure. Fuck it. Superannuated. An expatriate of dubious propensities, but distinguished origins, the somewhat spoiled and superannuated man of pleasure. Don't you just love when we look up words together?
Superannuated.
I said it correctly.
Superannuated.
Outmoded or old-fashioned. That's what that means. Though during the latter part of 1818, very often he is said to have been so disturbed by the confusion of his household that he would leave the palazzo and spend the night in his gondola, out on the lagoon. And though the complication of his intrigues was labyrinthine, seldom had he been more busily occupied to better purpose. Erratic hours and irregular methods had always suited him. He preferred to write when his imagination was inflamed. The cumulative excitement of the day coursing through his system, and since frequently he did not leave his bed till late in the afternoon, passed several hours in bathing and dressing, after which he needed exercise and congenial company. He could rarely sit down to his writing table till night had descended. Then he wrote rapidly, feverishly, with few erasures. I think he's getting bored with Venice now. Okay. This book has fallen apart. I've carried this book through 4 countries. Read it all over England, Ireland, Scotland. The United States. Okay, that's 3 countries. No, I was in France with this book. That's 4. He was somewhat taken aback by this change of attitude, by the origins of any love affair. But the origins of any love affair are hard to analyze. For besides the immediate physical or sentimental sympathy that may be assumed to spring up between 2 human beings, an element that in the majority of love affairs is often exaggerated, we must recognize the period of preparation that precedes acquaintanceship, and the various factors that have produced a determination to fall in love. On Byron's side, the existence of preparatory factors was fairly obvious. After 2 years of dissipation, he was sick of debauchery. Mentally and physically he was a little tired. While to be out of love was a condition that had always irked him, it was as if his temperament were cut off from a drug he needed. Equally plain to distinguish were the motives of the other party. Teresa Guccioli was between 19 and 20 and had been married a year, the 3rd wife of a rich Romognol landowner. She had taken over a family of grown-up stepchildren, and the time had come when, by all the conventions, she might demand her liberty. Nor was Guccioli the kind of husband to dispute her wishes. 60 years old, wealthy and good-natured, absorbed in local politics, a cultivated man of the world, with his life behind him. He was prepared for infidelity, though he would demur at scandal. Things might take their course according to the accepted usages of the Venetian moral code. So he goes to a few women, and this woman. He has this amazing love story with this woman, and she's married. They go through. First, the guy doesn't mind, and then he does mind, and Byron can take her on dates. And then he actually moves into their family home. And Byron's got servants, and he's got all these different pets. I mean, there's a list of the pets that he had somewhere in here. But this guy lets him move in with pretty much his own personal zoo, and with the knowledge that he's having sex with his 40-year younger wife under his roof. But he was unlike any man she had yet encountered. His noble and exquisitely beautiful countenance means face, wrote Teresa Guccioli, the tone of his voice, his manners, the 1,000 enchantments that surrounded him, rendered him so different and so superior a being to any whom I had hitherto seen, that it was impossible he should not have left the most profound impression upon me. That's something Teresa wrote about him. So Teresa's got her family her father and her brother are involved in radical Italian politics, and of course Byron is sympathetic. Him and Teresa grow closer. She wants a divorce from this old dude. The Vatican and the Pope grants them a separation, and it's strange that like Byron actually stays living in the dude's house for a while. All right. Back in England, the Peterborough massacre happens in Manchester against these workers who are just trying to get like an extra penny a month or whatever the hell it is. And Byron wrote, anything is preferable. Better to be an unskilled planter, an awkward settler, than a flatterer of fiddlers, a fan carrier of a woman. I like women, God he knows, but the more their system here develops upon me, the worse it seems. I have been an intriguer, a husband, a whoremonger, and now I am a cavaliere servante. By the holy, it is a strange sensation. In high spirits and full of his usual frolicsome gaiety. Yeah, so they end up moving back to Ravenna, which is the town that this guy is from, and Teresa. The Count, Byron recorded, actually came to me crying about it. Teresa's friends and relatives were in despair, since an elopement in Italy is the devil, worse even than with us, because it is super shit. Time to learn another word. Super. I'm gonna need your help, Websters. Super. Super irrigation?
Supererogation.
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 The act of performing more than is required by duty, obligation, or need.
Supererogation.
The act of performing more than is required by duty, obligation, or need.
Supererogation.
Because it is supererogation and shows headlong character. With the happiness of his mistress and the honor of her family both at stake, Byron's decision could scarcely have been more difficult. On the one hand, he must sacrifice a woman whom I loved for life, leaving her destitute and divided from all ties in case of my death. On the other, give up an Amicziza's shit. Amicizia. Okay, it's an Italian word. It's not in the Webster's Dictionary. Give up his amicizia, which had been my pleasure, my pride, my passion. At 20, of course, he would have acted differently, but at 30, with the experience of 10 such years, he reviewed the backward vista of tears and grievances and recriminations, scandals and disappointments, and hopeless bitterness. He decided that he must play safe and act in the spirit of middle age. With the greatest difficulty, he persuaded Teresa to rejoin her husband and go back to Ravenna and her home and family. For himself, he did not absolutely deny that he might at length rejoin her. Otherwise, she had declared that she would not betray him. She ends up coming back to him. They end up getting back together. Oh, and all these men that he had, this is interesting, Scrope Davies, this wild drunk friend of his, and Beau Brummel. These guys ended up, he gets word. He finds out, he's going on with his life, he's cut off from England, and then during March arrived the news of the extinction, at least so far as London was concerned, of another English boon companion, the easy-going, irresponsible, perpetually effervescent Scrope Davies, who had at length ruined himself by gambling and had fled to Bruges. Thus poor Scrope, whom Byron recollected having deserted hopelessly drunk at a gambling hell, where he appeared to be losing heavily, and discovered next morning, fast asleep, a chamber pot brimming with banknotes beside his bed. That was when he was in Cambridge. He went to university with Scrope, and he was gambling and drunk, and they left him, and he thought that he was going to lose, and then the next morning he finds him, and he's got dollar bills, y'all, overflowing from a piss bucket. Had followed in the footsteps of his acquaintance Brummel. At Bruges he would be condemned to drink Dutch beer, and no doubt shoot himself the first foggy morning. With a sigh, Byron considered his fellow exiles, writing from an Italian palace to Hobhouse, immured in a London jail. Brummel at Calais, Scrope at Bruges, Bonaparte at St. Helena, you in your new apartments, and I at Ravenna. I forgot. I don't know why Hobhouse was put in jail, but interesting that all of his best friends and people he looked up to were all in exile or in jail. There has been nothing like it since Thermocles at Magnesia and Marius at Carthage. But times changed, he added, and they are luckiest who get over their first rounds at the beginning of the battle. His own seclusion might be monotonous. It was by no means painful, and once he had accustomed himself to the initial indignities of serventismo, he soon settled down to the peaceful regimen of love and small talk. Right. Even for our virtues we must pay a price. From the moment he took up his quarters at Palazzo Guiccioli, Byron gained in respectability and composure and well-being. The price that his fate exacted of him was paid in boredom, but it was not boredom of a virulent or particularly destructive kind. Rather the acquiescent, half-contented ennui of a man who has outlived his capacity for violent feeling, and is glad to believe that the stormier emotions can no longer touch his heart. So Teresa actually insisted to her husband that you're going to lose me forever if you don't let Byron move in. But still there were problems. Oh, this is the thing. So Byron's got money, and he wants to start this magazine called The Liberal back in England. He hires this guy who comes to Italy, and he's a total douche. The fuck was that guy's name? And Byron pays for this guy and his family to come to Italy, and everything goes bad. Okay. Okay, here, as at Ravenna. Tita, that was Byron's wild-eyed gondolier. So there's a few different ruckuses that happen, and one involves that douche that Byron hired to come and get this magazine off the ground called The Liberal. He started an incident with some locals, and there were different kingdoms back then. Italy was not united, and they were suspicious of all foreigners. And Teresa's brother and father were involved with these rebels, and now Tita gets into he gets arrested and ordered to shave off his beard, since beards and whiskers were an indication of revolutionary sympathies. Cool. So Byron's shit is weak, and the local authorities are keeping an eye on him. And yes, he does have revolutionary sympathies. It was clear that he lived on the memories of a preceding age. His talk was anything but literary, except when Shelley was near him. but seasoned with anecdotes of the great actors on and off the stage, boxers, gamblers, duelists, drunkards, etc., etc., and embellished with slang and scandal that he alone remembered. More and more he was possessed by a rage for writing. Right. Was Byron demonic and Shelley angelic? But if Byron glowed with a dark, destructive energy, hurtful to himself and sometimes fatal to others, it must be allowed that often angels make dangerous house companions. They are dangerous, that is to say, because lacking the earthly virtues of common sense, they wave their wings and scatter their gifts a trifle indiscriminately, for the sheer joy of exercising their heavenly office. It is an angel's business to love, and love he must. He does not reflect always that the value of love depends, to a very large extent, upon the attention and delicacy with which it is placed, and that love seriously misplaced may be worse than hatred. Love can demoralize more quickly than loathing. It gives trivial objects an importance they cannot sustain, lifts weak spirits to an altitude from which they are bound to tumble, envelops a Harriet and throws her at last into the suicide's graveyard. Shelley believed in love with an abstract fervor. The sentiment provided its own nobility and its own excuse. Like all idealists who have contracted the insidious habit of discussing philosophy late in the night with attractive and susceptible young women, long after their wives had gone, exhausted, to bed, Shelley seems not always to have been very clear when philosophy withdrew from the field and passion replaced it. Well, what does that mean? Mary Shelley concluded is under the dominion of the mythical monster everybody. I tell her I am one of the nobodies, but the shadow of the mythical monster was lengthening across Mary's spirit. She was worried what everybody would think. That's the mythical monster, everybody. Like we live under the FOMO, fear of missing out, and we're all on these social media platforms and wanting likes and shit. She was constantly worried what everybody would think, and Shelley kept telling her he's a nobody and he didn't give a shit what everybody thought. Since early spring, Byron and Shelley had both been boat owners, for under Trelawney's influence, they had commissioned his friend, Captain Roberts of the Royal Navy, to construct them 2 crafts in the shipyards of Genoa. Okay, this is when they're in Italy, they buy the boats. Okay, this is when Shelley dies. So, Shelley's boat was called the Ariel, and Byron's yacht was called the Bolivar. I guess named after Simone. Housekeeping, complained Mary, was extremely difficult. They could not have been more isolated had they been shipwrecked sailors. But Shelley, with his passion for sea and solitude, and the passion for sympathy and beauty that fed on the sight of Jane, lived in a halcyon world of sensation and imagination, where Mary and the influence of her mythical monster could rarely penetrate. Meanwhile, life at Pisa was calm and easy. Rogers reappeared, accompanied him when he rode out in the afternoons, and was amused to note on the face of a peasant girl, said to be Byron's favorite, a look of pleasure and dignity as they passed her by. Wow. So Byron had a little peasant girl he would poke when he would go for a ride. Okay, so Mary Shelley is not that fun to be around. Once at least he distressed Mary by returning naked from a bath, and in that condition gliding swiftly through the common dining room, where the party, which included a literary visitor, were all assembled. Okay, so Jane Williams, I guess, is this mistress Shelley gets up with. Shelley had complained to Williams of being unusually nervous. Stopping short, he grasped me violently by the arm and stared steadfastly on the white foam upon the beach under our feet. I demanded of him if he were in pain, but he only answered by saying, "There it is again, there." He recovered after some time and declared that he saw, as plainly as he then saw me, a naked child. Allegra. Allegra had died in that monastery because Byron had neglected her. And Shelley, of all people, was more haunted over Allegra's death than Byron was. So Shelley's having visions, and he's a nervous wreck. I mean, imagine, what was that? The Sixth Sense. I see dead people. Shelley keeps seeing the dead, naked child Allegra popping up everywhere. So he sees a naked child, Allegra, rise from the sea and clap its hands in joy, smiling at him. This was a trance that it required some reasoning and philosophy to awaken him from. So forcibly had the vision operated in his mind. Lee Hunt, that's the cunt that, Lee Hunt the cunt is the guy that Byron paid for him and his family to come. Oh, and another thing about Byron I love, he brought guns with him everywhere. He slept with guns by his head, and hurrying onto the balcony with a brace of loaded pistols, he threatened that he would shoot down all the combatants unless they immediately desisted, in spite of which it proved necessary to call the police. This was when Lee Hunt had he's there, he's being lazy, he's not generating the work that he needs to do, and then he gets into this tiff with one of the local Italians, and it was this big hubbub. Okay, here we go. This is where Shelley's going to die. A sailor, using a speaking trumpet, shouted to them to reef their sails or they would be lost. Ah, yes. When Ariel, that's Shelley's boat, was finally dragged from the seabed, there were indications that she had been run down by another vessel, for her starboard quarter was stove in, evidently by a blow from the sharp bows of a felucca, and since the boat was undecked, had foundered instantly. That Shelley was the victim of a piratical onslaught by fishermen who believed that the rich Englishmen had embarked with them with a large sum in gold is also a suggestion that has been put forward. But regarding none of these suggestions can we hope to arrive at certainty. It is plain, however, he had had such a death as he would have he himself desired, and no doubt he sank as again and again he had announced that he intended to do, quickly without protest or ignominious struggle. For nearly a fortnight nothing was heard at Leghorn of Ariel's crew, and on the third day Trelawney rode to Pisa, warned Hunt, then went upstairs to speak to Byron. When I told him, his lip quivered, and his voice faltered as he questioned me. Soon afterwards a punt, a keg, and some bottles that had belonged to the Ariel were salvaged along the coast. 10 days later 2 bodies were thrown ashore, one near Viareggio, and the second 3 miles away at Bocca Lauricio. The first Trelawney recognized as that of Shelley, not by the features, for both the face and hands were entirely fleshless, but by the tall, slight figure, the schoolboy jacket, the volume of Aeschylus in one pocket, and the copy of Keats's poems, borrowed from Lee Hunt and hastily turned back at Liama, which had been thrust into another. I can recognize only one by the teeth with whom I have talked. I always watch the lips and the mouth. They tell what the tongue and the eyes try to conceal. Okay, so this has got to be when they're burning Shelley's body. Shelley's limbs did not fall from the trunk when they were touched, and the corpse was lifted whole onto the funeral furnace. Then the wood was kindled. Trelawney threw frankincense and salt into the fire and poured wine and oil over the body. The oil and salt gave the flames a peculiar glistening and quivering brilliance. Watching from Byron's carriage, which he had not had the strength to leave, Hunt observed the inconceivable beauty of the shimmering flame sheet as it bore away towards heaven in vigorous amplitude. It seemed as though it contained the glassy essence of vitality. So fierce was the combined radiance of fire and sun that all around the atmosphere waved and trembled. Meanwhile, the corpse had fallen open, disclosing the heart, which Trelawney claimed afterwards to have snatched from the brazier, and the frontal bone of the skull having dropped away, Shelley's brains cupped in a broken cranium on the red-hot furnace bars, literally seethed, bubbled, and boiled as in a cauldron for a very long time. The last was a detail that deeply impressed Byron, and to which in later conversation he often returned. Did I ever tell you about the time I saw Shelley's skull crack open and his brains bubbling? It's interesting. It impressed Byron, and to which in later conversation he often referred. Hey, that reminds me of Shelley's brains popped open. Byron drank heavily and wrote late. Hunt retired early and rose irritable. His study had been fixed in a small room overlooking the courtyard with an orange tree before the window, and from this refuge he would listen to the noises of the floor above, the piano, where Byron and his household were established. He came to recognize them. In a short time he had come to hate them. The great man was a leisurely and languid riser, lounging aimlessly about his room while he read and breakfasted, gossiping with the English valet if his temper was good. More exasperating still, he loved to sing. To poor Hunt, rigid with annoyance at his table below, was he not conscious of his superior musical sensitiveness? Would float the strains of his voice. Anyway, that's Leigh Hunt. Swarthy-skinned peasant mother who served them ripe figs under a garden trellis, cracking, Hunt remembered, some extraordinary jokes, which embarrassed him insofar as they were comprehensible. Yes, he was a prude. Oh, here we go. This is the Hunts or Cunts section. How are we doing on time here? Are we rocking this? Hunt's ideal Italy continually failed to materialize. The real Italy he neither understood nor could learn to delight in. Its mountains were too bare, its outlines too sharp, its lanes too stony, its voices too loud, its long summer too dusty. He was ill, uncomfortable, in a perpetual fever, longing for the greenness and neatness of the fields round London, from which one returned to one's own prettily appointed suburban parlor, with the teacups, the rosewood pianoforte. Pianoforte. Pianoforte.
Pianoforte.
Pianoforte.
Pianoforte.
It's a piano. The rosewood piano, the bust, the vases, or for the snug, appealing romanticism of the English Lake District. At home in the Palazzo Langfranchi, his consolations were few. Of the kind of inverted snobbery from which her husband suffered, Mrs. Hunt presented even severer symptoms, and she had reached Italy armed with the determination, on the one hand, that she would not condescend to speak the language, It was beneath her to try and learn the language. On the other hand, that her attitude towards Byron should make it clear that his fame and title left her unimpressed. They're there because Byron's paying for it, but she wants to let it be known that she's unimpressed with his fame and title. That's why I wrote at the top of page 210, hunts are cunts. He was treated, therefore, to an alarming display of middle-class dignity, in, occasional touches of feminine malice. Whenever, in his efforts to placate her, he laid himself open to them, any suspicion of covert ridicule had always upset him. "What do you think, Mrs. Hunt?" he once remarked. "Trelawney has been speaking against my morals. What do you think of that?" "It is the first time I ever heard of them," Mrs. Hunt replied, with a sniff or snicker not difficult to imagine. Byron, Hunt noted with some relish, was completely dashed and reduced to silence. But Byron thought them dirty, noisy. Oh, these kids! They've got these. They brought these children. Incidentally, he had developed a violent dislike for his visitors' children. Hunt considered their behavior above reproach. They had lived in a natural, not an artificial state, and were equally sprightly, respectful, and possessed. But Byron thought them dirty, noisy, and mischievous. They were a crawl of Hottentots. He said a pack of yahoos, and since he expected them as soon as they arrived to proceed to the most monstrous acts of vandalism, he had posted his fierce bulldog on the main staircase, with strict orders to keep off the little cockneys, lest they should extend their depredations to his first-floor rooms. The same bulldog savaged Hunt's goat, a melancholy survivor of storm and shipwreck, and had bitten off one of its ears before the victim was rescued. Hunt was devoted to his children and fond of animals, while Byron's feeling for both species was capricious and self-centered, and his touchiness grew more pronounced as his health deteriorated. These people gotta go. So Byron gets rid of these people finally. And now is the allure of Greece is calling him. He had always wanted to return there. Greece was under the rule of Turkey, the Ottoman Empire, and Byron felt this kind of romanticism about Greek independence and Greek breaking away from Turkish rule, and he felt somehow that it was his destiny to be a part of it. So he followed closely not only the rebel events in Italy, but what was happening in Greece. Plainly across the Atlantic, there was none of that apathy towards his poems and dramas, which he suspected now and then must exist in London. But counterbalancing the attraction of the New World was the idea of Greece. So now in young America, the United States, Byron's stuff is starting to sell. And when he left Venice, Newstead Abbey was finally sold, and now he is set for life with cash. The appeal that it exercised was largely an emotional one. He was dominated by images of the past. In the past lay happiness, and at no period of his existence had life been happier, had youth been more enjoyable and joy less transitory than in the 2 rambling, discursive years of Near Eastern travel. The ideas of youth and freedom were closely intertwined. Now Greece, the country of his youth, was struggling to be free, just as he himself was struggling to throw off his servitude, and he listened eagerly to every report that arrived from the Grecian patriots. There's some club that he belonged to, this League of Gentlemen in London, and they were all giving up money for the Greek independence cause, and these guys voted for Byron to go over there and take a peek at what was happening. That was nice of these rich twats to vote for their friend to go over. Byron was not alone in Yet his failure was crushing and comprehensive, and here, not for the first time, one is confronted by the paradoxical observation that although men make up an age, the age itself is contributory in making men. A poet may help to shape the future. He is controlled and shaped, nevertheless, by the immediate past and by the influence with which it bears down upon the present. Crystallized is the intangible contemporary atmosphere. Coleridge and Wordsworth belonged to the generation that had been excited almost beyond endurance by the events of 1789. That was the French Revolution. Troubled and horrified by the growth of the terror and profoundly stirred by the astonishing spectacle of Napoleon's rise. Some had welcomed, some had shuddered at the revolution, but in both instances the shock went very deep, and the shocks that followed it were demoralized and at length disabling. Thus Wordsworth, receding into a graceless conservatism, the youth and strength of his imagination gradually losing ground, enthusiasm giving way to arid prejudice. By 1822, and even earlier, he was regarded along with Southey as poetic arch-traitor to the Liberal cause and the hireling representative of the Tory government, whose principles and pension he had accepted. Okay, so Coleridge sold himself out. Wordsworth sold himself out to the conservatives for a pension. Yet opium was not the sole, nor indeed was it the main cause of Coleridge's failure. So Coleridge was an opium addict. Drug addiction, like chronic alcoholism, is more often a symptom that is the disease itself, though the malady of which Coleridge's case, it might have been symptomatic, was a type that baffles analysis and defies cure. Okay, this guy is reflecting on the Romantic poets, of which Shelley and Byron were the kings. Shelley confused ecstasy and imagination. Just as in the field of politics he confused the hatred of tyranny, which may have a private psychological basis, with a defense of the intellectual principles on which freedom has been established. Indeed, his liberalism never quite emerged from the period when, accompanied by the pretty stupid girl whom he had rescued from her boarding school, he attempted to launch an English revolution with the help of paper boats, handbills scattered fancifully from high windows, and messages in bottles committed to the waves. His genius is most apparent when he is least declamatory, when he forgets the helter-skelter rush of rhetorical abstractions that went streaming through his mind. Kings of suns and stars, demons and gods, gleaming like meteors, blazing like planets, and comes home to the self and the self-perplexities, its loves and its disappointments, the beauty and the misery of a finite universe. Who was sending me messages? Okay. So, Byron goes to hang out. He leaves Teresa. He goes to hang out at some port where there's these Greek nationalists, and they smell rich guy with money. And they're all squeezing him for dough. And the Greek independence movement has no money. Byron puts up 4,000 pounds, which in 1822, that's a fortune. Basically to refit the entire navy of the Greek independence movie. Oh, there's a couple interesting lines from the end of this book. The poet, in fact, above all other things, must be a personality. Nationalism was essentially a romantic movement, and from nationalism sprang the half-baked racial theorist with his romantic belief in the superiority of the Aryan blood and his romantic distrust of the use of reason. Wow. So, white nationalism identified with Romanticism in England. For Romantic literature appeals to that strain of anarchism which inhabits a dark corner of every human mind and is continually advancing the charms of extinction against the claims of life. The beauty of all that is fragmentary and youthful and half-formed, as opposed to the compact achievement of adult genius. So, nowadays he was content with the pleasures of friendship. He liked the sympathy of this attractive, experienced woman, whom he could shock, then conciliate, then shock again, feeling all the while that he continued to hold her interest and perhaps to touch her heart. Moreover, she provided an excuse for his favorite mental indulgence. He could give way to the joys of recollection and incessantly remember aloud. Byron loved to reflect and think about shit. So that's Byron in Italy. He gets up. He goes to Greece. First he's going to go there just to observe. But everybody's asking him for money. And he's basically... Byron agreed to pay for 500 soldiers. Another 100 were added to his detachment at government expense, and now had what he had perhaps often dreamed of, his own private army of Sulawats, exiled warriors from the mountains of Albania. And while he was in Italy, Byron learned the Albanian language. And sat down and helped come up with the first Albanian dictionary with the help of an Albanian priest. There's so many details about this guy's life. Despite the wealth of some of the Greek leaders, not one seemed able to help him in financing the forces of liberation. His 500 Sulawats had brought with them another 700 dependents and expected him to provide for them all. And when supplies arrived, these proud mountain people refused to demean themselves by carrying them up the beach. When William Perry, the firemaster in charge of the artillery equipment, finally reached Missolonghi, prepared to take charge of the unit, he found that there was hardly any money for his work, and Byron, as usual, supplied the deficiency. Indeed, it began to seem more and more as though he alone was expected to finance the attack on Lepanto. Perry soon sensed that he felt himself deceived and abandoned. I had almost said, betrayed in his heart. He felt that he was forlorn and forsaken. His silhouette's quarrelsome and is concerned with punctilio honor. Is that in here? Is that a Greek word? Punctilio. Punctilio. Don't be a punctilio. A minute detail of conduct in a ceremony or in observance of a code.
Punctilio.
His Sulawats, quarrelsome and as concerned with punctilio, honor, and precedence as a court full of diplomats, bickered endlessly and violently among themselves, unwilling to take orders from or even cooperate with each other. It was a mess. Most of them wanted to be officers. Pietro Gamba, that was Teresa's brother, reported that out of 300 or 400 actual Sulawats, There should be about 150 above the rank of common soldiers. Their object, of course, was to increase their pay. Byron refused to have any more to do with them. They may go to the Turks or to the devil, he wrote to Mavrocordato. Faced with the sudden termination of their relative wealth, the Silhouettes agreed to form a more orderly troop, because Byron was going to cut off the cash. Maybe we should stop being dicks. Yeah, these guys wouldn't even march unless Byron paid them money. So they're just squeezing this guy. We are all very well now, and everything appears to wear a hopeful aspect. But he was neither really well nor in any true sense optimistic. His Silhouettes had decided that the proposed attack on Lepanto did not really appeal to them. They owned that they did not like to fight against stone walls, Pietro recorded. Lord Byron offered to give them a month's pay if they would go. Then on Saturday, February 21st, an earthquake shook the little town. Superstitiously, the whole army discharged their arms, Byron noted dryly, upon the same principle that savages beat drums or howl during an eclipse. But despite these revivals of his caustic wit, he felt that he. That's my ringtone. Okay, sorry about that. The whole army discharged their arms, Byron noted dryly, upon the same principle that savages beat drums or howl during an eclipse. But despite these revivals of his caustic wit, he felt that he had come to the end of his hopes. And 1 week I have been in a fit. The troops mutinied. Sass killed, an earthquake, thunder, lightning, and torrents of rain. Such a week I never witnessed. He said to Perry, to others he observed, my situation here is unbearable. A town without any resources, and a government without money, imprisoned by floods, unable to take any exercise, without the means of doing anything either to relieve them or myself. On April 18th, however, Byron was once more delirious. Leeches were after all applied and calmed him, but he was weaker now. He had apparently accepted the fact that he was dying. Outside his room, the servants, alerted by the anxiety of the doctors, had begun to gather, hushed, some already weeping. Byron said to Millingen, your efforts to preserve my life will be in vain. Die I must. I feel it. Its loss I do not lament. For to terminate my wearisome existence I came to Greece. He added a request. Let not my body be hacked or be sent to England. Here let my bones moulder. Lay me in the first corner without pomp or nonsense. Millingen tells us with infinite regret that during all this time Byron did not make even the smallest mention of religion. At one moment I heard him say, shall I sue for mercy? After a long pause he added, come, no weakness. Let's be a man to the last. And now it seems as if, briefly, without volition, Byron wore perhaps the last of his many masks. Not now that of an aloof aristocrat or unprincipled lecher, not that of a hectic lover, dandy, or melancholy poet, but that of a man of action, the warrior and hero, thus attempting for one more time to command reality, resetting the scene in the only way which could give meaning to his present condition. Perry, arriving, found him shouting, English and Italian, alternating, forward, forward, courage, follow my example, don't be afraid. It was for a moment on the ramparts of Lepanto that he played the drama of the death that should have been. He should have died in action. That's what he thought was going to happen. But he got sick, and he died in this Milangoni, how do you say that town? And he had stopped off there on his younger voyages for a moment. but he died. They were trying to regroup and get enough to have this battle, but it never happened. And he did not die in action. He died of a fever. He should perhaps have realized long before that he had already gone beyond action, having become a legend. The greatest genius of the century, Goethe, who perhaps really was the greatest genius of the century, called Byron that. For he had embodied a new self-awareness, had asserted in his words and his adventure that rebellious individualism, which was to become for 100 years the very essence of European civilization. For 20 years and more, the mode of the life of Europe's most vigorous and gifted young men was to be influenced, perhaps dominated, by what they understood of Byron. So he ignited all this adventure, all this traveling, all this poetry, all this romanticism. Even if he was a cock at times, even if he was a rich douche, even if he followed his cock, even if he squirted in his sister like an animal, the guy influenced so much of 19th century European culture, and all these men wanted to emulate him, if not the actual person that he was, but the characters of Childe Harold, and then in his greatest work, Don Juan, which he wrote while he was started writing in Venice, and then later in Italy when he was with Teresa and her husband, he wrote The Adventures of Don Juan, his most famous work. So the reason I wanted to learn about Lord Byron was because when I was 10 years old to 12 years old, my family lived in Wilmington, North Carolina, in a housing development called Kings Grant, and we lived on Lord Byron Road. And I've always been fascinated what was so important about this guy that he was important enough to have a road in Wilmington, North Carolina named after him. So I think that was a pretty epic life. Obviously, I think the people in North Carolina where transgender bathrooms are an issue and all kinds of religious observances keep people from fully blossoming their personalities. Probably, my guess is whoever named that housing development had no idea what Lord Byron's life was like. They just thought it was a catchy name. Lord Byron Road. And Lord Byron was returned to Nottinghamshire, and he is buried in his former home, Newstead Abbey. And one day I would like to visit there and take her pilgrimage. Anyway, that's today's episode, and I hope it has enriched your brain and your life. I hope you enjoyed me reading to you. Byron in Italy by Peter Quinnell, and then a few last things. Lord Byron by Peter Brent. And this concludes the Lord Byron trilogy episodes of Tom Rhodes Radio Smart Camp. Shalom, amigos y amigas. Long may you run, and long may you drag your Lord Byron club foot. I love you. Shalom, amigos y amigas.
Tom Rhodes, you're a funny man. Tom Rhodes, you're an international comedian. Tom Rhodes, karate kick, baby, oh yeah. Tom Rhodes, you're a groovy dude. You go all around the world, telling jokes to all of the people. You are an international comedian. You're funny to everybody in every single country in the world. Tom Rhodes, I like you very much. I think you're talented and very wonderful. Tom Rhodes, you're the best guy in the world. I wanna be your friend, you should call me sometime. Here is my phone number, 603-644-0048. Yeah, yeah, yeah. Tom Rhodes. You're an international comedic sensation. Tom Rhodes, I like to listen to your podcast. Tom Rhodes, you're the best man to ever walk on the earth.